This is a 24-year-old Proflex 856 full suspension mountain bike frame. It was radical when it first launched and it still looks radical today, all these years later. Now, I haven't gone mad. I'm not having a midlife crisis. There's a good reason I bought this frame, which I'll explain later in the video, so keep watching. But first, let's go into details about this frame and the real reason I bought this frame. So I got into mountain biking in the 90s as a teenager, and mountain biking was a young, exciting, dynamic, rebellious sport. We're a big tech focus with new bikes coming out all the time. Now, bikes were pretty basic back then. There wasn't much technology to speak of. And when the Proflex arrived on the scene, they looked like something from the future, with a bright red frame, yellow elastomer shock, and this mad Gervin fork on the front. And I always wanted one. I really wanted one of these, but I could never afford one, never had the opportunity to own one, let alone ride one. So 24 years later, my dreams sort of have come true, and I thought I'd buy one. Now, the reason for buying it is because I want to do an old versus new comparison to see how this retro frame compares to a modern frame of equivalent design and suspension travel, based on the success and popularity of my previous old versus new road bike video, which if you've missed it, that's linked above. As you can see, it's pretty battered, there's lots of scratches all over it. It's not in the best condition at all. The previous owner told me he bought it as a project to do it up and respray it and do a really nice job on it, which would look amazing. But I think it'd be a shame, because all these scratches, they tell a story. They show it's been used. They show how much abuse and enjoyment is given its previous owners over its lifetime. So I don't think I'm going to tart it up too much. I'll give it a clean, make sure it's all serviceable. The bottom bracket might need replacing, and I'm going to try and build it up with as many period parts as possible. But if you know the retro scene, old parts which haven't been abused are pretty expensive and can go for quite a tidy sum. So I'm going to try and keep the price down. I don't want to spend a fortune on it. And I've got some parts, but I'm missing a few parts. So if you have any old 90s mountain bike components just lying around your shed or garage you don't want and you're happy to donate, let me know down in the comment section below. I'd love to hear from you. Any help would be appreciated. So that's the idea for this video. But first, let's go into detail about the Proflex 856 and why it's such an iconic bike, and why for me it's a really important bike in the evolution of the mountain bike from 24 years ago to a modern mountain bike. It's worth remembering, especially if you're a younger viewer, that during the 90s, mountain bikes were very rudimentary, basic, simple bikes. Most were rigid and a lot of them were steel frames. There was no suspension to speak of. There were cantilever brakes. V-brakes were a revolution when they came out. And 26-inch wheels, remember those? 26-inch wheels, whatever happened to those? Stems were very long, handlebars very narrow, and the bar ends were a common sight on the start line of cross-country races. So very basic bikes. So when Proflex came along in the early 90s with their radical looking full suspension frame, it shocked a lot of people. And it's worth remembering that a lot of people didn't want suspension because they couldn't see the benefits of suspension, front or rear, for mountain biking, where weight was a key focus because suspension adds weight. The frame was entirely made from aluminium with a 7005 double-butted main frame, a box section swing arm, and very slim rear stays connecting the rear shock or the elastomers to the frame. And up front we have a Gervin suspension fork, also made from aluminium. Suspension travel on this 856 is 3.5 inches on the rear and 2.5 inches on the front, I believe, according to the old catalogues I found. Earlier bikes had less travel. There's not much travel, admittedly, but it's fairly comparable to modern XC race bikes, so no, not too bad at all. And a key defining feature of the Proflex were the bright yellow elastomers that were used in place of coil shocks or air shocks. It's worth remembering back in the 90s that air shocks weren't very advanced or very reliable, and coil shocks were quite heavy. And because Proflex were trying to appeal to cross-country racers who were obsessed with weight, the elastomers offered a lightweight and simple maintenance-free solution. They're actually called Interdamp, but they're just foam springs really, nothing more advanced than that. And they were light and very easy to adjust with a preload collar on the top to adjust for different rider weight and courses you ride on, make it firmer or softer. And while they worked, they weren't that reliable. They were very prone to ambient temperature, so they would get stiffer in cold weather, and they didn't last very long. In fact, I'm not even sure if these work anymore. They feel pretty rigid, so yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not very confident that these still work. Now, I do believe this frame should have elastomers on the front, but we see a updated, upgraded coil spring, a Gervin ODS oil damped system, which we saw on later models. So I think this bike can be retrofitted with a coil shock, and it does seem to work reasonably well in a bit of testing I've done. The Gervin fork still looks as radical as when it first came out, and there have been a few attempts to do a similar full-length fork since then, but most forks today are telescopic forks. Now, the idea around this fork when it was released was to get around the inherent issues with very early telescopic forks, which weren't very good, very short travel, 60 or 80 millimeters in some cases. They were heavy and weren't very reliable, and stitching was a key issue because you basically have a tube inside a tube rolling on bearings, and they weren't that good. So the Gervin fork was an attempt to get around the stitching issues to create a stiffer fork. It didn't flex when you're braking. So that is the reason for the radical looking Gervin fork, which still looks radical today, and an improvement, it has to be said, on the early flex stem that came before it. So we have some very period correct details as you'd expect. We're a square taper 68mm bottom bracket. We've got canty bosses for cantilever brakes or V brakes, which came out in the mid-90s. We have a slightly dropped top tube for a bit more clearance. The interrupted seat tube design, which was very popular at the time, with Specialized doing the same with their FSR design. And we've got two bottle cage bosses, one on a down tube and one on a seat tube as well. Proflex was launched by an American guy called Bob Gervin, who actually launched the Flex Stem in 1988. That was his first product. Now, the Flex Stem is an infamous product, it has to be said, with quite a reputation, but it's a product that's been brought back to life in the gravel bike market. The concept's not a bad one, it's just early editions were hampered by poor manufacturing and materials available at the time, but modern incarnations are much better, thankfully, and suit modern gravel riding. But thankfully, mountain biking has moved on to suspension. So the Flex Stem was the first product, and that was attached to a rigid frame with a rigid fork. And then in 1990, they came out with the first rear suspension frame, also using a rigid fork with the Flex Stem. So very basic, very early suspension, it has to be said. And then in 1993, they came out with the 953, which basically used this same frame design, and of course the Gervin fork, which was a radical departure from the Flex Stem and aimed to get around the issues with early suspension forks, telescopic suspension forks at the time from RockShox, like the Quadra 5 and the Mag 21, and Pace and Manti were doing similar forks. So Gervin was their solution. And it's worth remembering, of course, that in the early days of mountain biking, cross-country racing reigned supreme, and riders were obsessed with low weight and pedaling efficiency, and they didn't see the benefits of full suspension. Now, we take full suspension bikes for granted these days because they're so good and are lightweight and efficient and amazing technology. So convincing early mountain bikers of the benefits of a full suspension frame was definitely an uphill battle. But here in the UK, they had a team racing on the cross-country circuit, and I particularly remember Caroline Alexandra racing a bright red Proflex around the local circuits here, and it had quite an impact on me. Trawling the internet for archive material to do research for this frame, I came across some interesting catalogues that pointed towards the company doing quite a bit of research and development around the benefits of suspension, and they did some lab testing in a university with a bunch of cyclists comparing the benefits of full suspension versus rigid bikes, which were popular at the time. And they claimed that the full suspension Proflex reduced oxygen consumption in an athlete going up a climb by 13%. So really early use of lab testing to promote the benefits of a design over the current standard at the time. Sadly, by the end of the 90s, in 2000 to be precise, Proflex wound up business and were no more. But what a shame. It only lasted 10 years or thereabouts, but they had quite an impact on the sport and probably helped to switch a lot of mountain bikers at the time to the benefits of full suspension. They're definitely a key part of the mountain bike story. There's lots of iconic bikes from the 90s that really helped to inform modern mountain bike design. And the Proflex, although brief, certainly had quite an impact on mountain biking, and clearly had quite an impact on me, because 24 years later I've bought a frame that I always wanted when I was young. So you know the reason for buying this frame. I'm going to build it up and do a retro versus modern comparison video, so stay tuned to that. Make sure you subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Got any questions about this bike, or if you own this bike and you raced it back in the day, I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your stories, so make sure you get down in the comment section and share away. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what the bike would like to ride, and if you have one now and you're still riding one, well, what's it like? Let me know down below, because I've not ridden one. I can't wait to get it built up and ridden as soon as possible, and share with you my thoughts on this bike and see how well it has aged or not aged. So yeah, we'll see. It's been an interesting time to see what it's all about. So there we go, the Proflex 856, a departure from my normal bike reviews, I know, but normal service will be resumed very soon. Hopefully you enjoyed watching the video, and if you did, hit that like button down below. Subscribe if you haven't already, especially if you want to see an update on this in a few weeks' time. And I'll promise I'll be quick building this frame, a bit quicker than that Chinese frame, which is almost there. I promise you, it's almost there. Any questions down below, and I'll see you all again soon. Thanks for watching.